all the news articles, all the headlines we've been hearing over the last week have been about how inflation is cooling. I don't know if you've been seeing this, but that's
Of
been
course.
everywhere. Inflation been cooling,
Yeah.
and at the same time, as you heard in this press conference, they're concerned that inflation hasn't cooled enough. Right? They're saying we are going to cut it by to 25 basis points, and he calls this restrictive, sufficiently restrictive. Just let's just keep that in mind. The restrictive terminology is being used for how much of a rate cut we're doing. Okay, so that means they're actually trying to. I suspect they're trying to thread the needle on the inflation issue, understanding we might get another resurgence. In fact, he's saying we might redescribe how we're describing all this because the inflation after the world shut down was due to supply chain issues,
Hmm.
and the incoming Trump administration with tariffs and change and what some might call protectionism can also be almost as significant with the rest of the world as other nations are going into their own recession. So we have the whole production issue abroad. So
Hmm.
I'm curious, Mike, what you're thinking about here as far as is inflation bottoming here, or are we just taking a pause and we're going to head down lower, or are we going to keep on rising, as I suspect?
I want to start by saying that if you look at the CME FedWatch tool, which I'll pull up here to give you a sense of how the markets actually expect the Fed to behave at each one of the meetings, if we go back to the historical chart from December 18th, we can see here that even as far back as October 10th, they were pricing in about an 85% probability of there being a 25 basis point cut. So the futures market has been expecting for nearly 2 months now that that's exactly what the Fed would do. There was some anticipation after the election, of course, that the tariffs would have an impact on inflation going forward. But interestingly, that didn't really change the market's expectation. The election didn't change the market's expectation of there being just a 25 basis point cut instead of a 50 basis point cut. So I think the Fed's behaving in line with market expectations. The restrictive narrative is really around this idea of continued anticipated rise in inflation. And I think that's largely the hawkish narrative that caused the market to pull back.
Right.
If we look at the expected changes in PCE, which is their preferred measure of inflation, I think that expectation is that it's going to rise from here.